There is a reason some relationships do not just hurt you. They rearrange you. They get under your skin, into your routines, into your thoughts, into the private language you use with yourself when no one else is around. And when it ends, or starts to break apart, you are left with a question that feels larger than the person themselves. Why did this happen to me? Why did this particular kind of love find me? Why did it go that deep? And the answer is usually more uncomfortable and more important than people want to admit. Because you did not stay in that dynamic simply because someone lied to you. Well, you stayed because on some level, the emotional environment already felt known. Not healthy, not peaceful, just known. The hunger to be chosen, the instinct to over-explain, the reflex to make yourself easier to love, the habit of doubting your own discomfort if someone else seemed certain enough. None of that began with them. They stepped into a place that was already there. That is what makes these relationships so disorienting. They do not just bring pain. They activate old pain. And when that happens, what feels like chemistry is often recognition. What feels like fate is often familiarity. What feels like being seen is sometimes just being accurately read by someone who knows how to move toward unmet needs and use them like an entry point. At first, it can feel almost sacred. You feel noticed in a way that bypasses your skepticism. They seem to understand the tenderness in you, the loneliness in you, the part of you that has carried too much for too long, without ever being fully held. And because they mirror what matters to you, because they move toward your hunger with precision, it can feel like finally arriving somewhere, finally being chosen, finally being understood without having to translate yourself. But what you are feeling in that moment is not safety. It is seduction through familiarity. That is why so many intelligent, self-aware, deeply caring people get caught in these bonds and then shame themselves afterward. They tell themselves they should have known. They tell themselves they missed the signs. But the harder truth is that when you have spent years learning that love comes with tension, inconsistency, self-erasure, or emotional labor, your nervous system does not always run toward peace. Sometimes it runs toward what it already knows how to survive. And survival can wear the face of devotion for a very long time. Maybe you learned early that love had to be earned by being useful. Maybe you learned to become easy, accommodating, emotionally fluent, low maintenance, forgiving beyond reason. Maybe your feelings were too inconvenient for the people who raised you. So you got better at reading the room than reading yourself. Maybe you became the one who calmed, adjusted, explained, smoothed things over, absorbed impact, kept the connection alive at your own expense. If that is your history, a narcissistic person does not need to create the pattern. They only need to step into it. And once they do, the relationship starts revealing things you were never meant to keep living with. Not all at once, slowly. First, you begin compromising in small ways that seem harmless. You doubt a reaction. You overlook a lie. You soften a boundary because you want to be fair. You tell yourself they are wounded, stressed, misunderstood, complicated, scared. You stay with your empathy because empathy has always felt like your best quality. But in these dynamics, empathy can become a trap when it is no longer connected to self-protection. You keep using your depth to excuse what your body already knows is not right. Then the confusion deepens. You start feeling guilty for having needs. You start rehearsing conversations before they happen. You start measuring truth by their mood. The relationship becomes less about connection and more about management. Management of tension, management of image, management of their reactions, management of your own reality so you can keep calling the situation love for just a little longer. And this is the part people outside the relationship rarely understand. The narcissistic dynamic does not only hurt because of cruelty, it hurts because it recruits you into your own disappearance. You become smaller to stay close, quieter to avoid punishment, more forgiving than you are honest, more patient than you are safe. And after a while, the most painful thing is not what they are doing. It is what you are watching yourself tolerate. That is why the relationship can become a turning point even while it is breaking you. Because eventually, the cost gets too visible. The anxiety gets too loud. The overthinking gets too constant. The emotional whiplash gets too exhausting to keep romanticizing. The little voice you kept silencing starts speaking from deeper in the body now, not as an opinion, but as a form of protest. Your sleep changes. Your appetite changes. Your sense of self starts fraying in ways you cannot hide from anymore. And what you once called love begins to look more like survival with occasional rewards. That is the moment the relationship starts changing meaning. It stops being only about them and starts becoming about what in you was willing to call this normal, not because you are weak, not because you wanted pain, but because some part of you had been trained to equate love with uncertainty, emotional labor, longing, and self-sacrifice. The relationship did not invent that wound. It exposed it. It put it under a brutal light. It showed you exactly how much of yourself you had been prepared to trade just to stay connected. And that is the revelation hidden inside the devastation. Because once you see it, really see it, your questions begin to change. You stop asking, how do I get them to understand me? And begin asking, why was I so ready to disappear just to keep this bond alive? You stop obsessing over whether they loved you and begin facing the deeper grief of how long you may have been trying to earn the kind of love that should never have required self-betrayal in the first place. That is not a glamorous awakening. It is usually humiliating at first. Raw, quiet. It strips away the fantasy that you are only dealing with a difficult person and asks you to look at the emotional inheritance underneath the whole thing. The people-pleasing, the fear of abandonment, the ache to be chosen, the tendency to romanticize inconsistency because consistency once felt foreign. None of that is easy to face, but it is where your power comes back. Because once the pattern is visible, the relationship stops being the center of the story. The real story becomes your return to yourself. And returning to yourself is not one dramatic moment. It is a long series of uncomfortable truths. It is saying no before you feel fully ready. It is letting people be disappointed in you without rushing to rescue their image of you. It is feeling the loneliness that comes when you stop performing the version of yourself that dysfunction was most comfortable around. It is grieving how much tenderness in you got used against you, without deciding that tenderness itself was the mistake. That matters, because your softness was never the problem. Your capacity to love was never the flaw. Your willingness to see the good in people was not what harmed you. What harmed you was being taught, somewhere along the way, that love required you to bleed quietly while calling it devotion. What harmed you was being disconnected from the instinct that says, this does not feel safe, and I do not need more evidence than that. So the healing is not about becoming hard. It is about becoming congruent. Your empathy stays, but now it stands beside discernment. Your love stays, but now it is no longer available at the price of your nervous system. Your generosity stays, but it no longer outranks your boundaries. And with each of those shifts, the kind of person who once felt magnetic to you starts feeling different, less mysterious, less compelling, more familiar in the wrong way. That is when you know something real is changing. Not when you stop hurting overnight. Not when you feel spiritually enlightened about the whole experience, but when chaos stops feeling like depth. When unpredictability stops feeling romantic. When your body no longer mistakes intensity for meaning. When being chosen stops mattering more than being safe. When peace begins to feel emotionally legible to you, then the relationship reveals its final truth. It was never proof that you were broken beyond repair. It was proof that something in you had been surviving on old instructions, and those instructions could no longer take you where your life needed to go. The relationship became unbearable because the self you were becoming could not keep living inside that distortion. What once felt familiar started feeling intolerable. What once felt like attachment started feeling like erosion. And that is not failure. That is awakening. So, no, it was not random in the deepest emotional sense. It entered through an old opening. It touched an old wound. It mirrored an old lesson you had been carrying long before that person ever arrived. But it also forced a confrontation that may never have happened any other way. It showed you where you still abandoned yourself. It showed you what your body already knew. It showed you the cost of calling pain by the name love. And once you see that clearly, the story changes. The narcissist is no longer the great mystery. The real transformation is what happens when you stop chasing meaning inside their behavior and start reclaiming meaning inside your own healing. Because the moment you do that, the experience stops being only a betrayal. It becomes an exposure of the wound, an exposure of the pattern, an exposure of the version of you that had learned to survive by staying disconnected from your own truth. And painful as that is, it is also where your life starts coming back to you.